Let's jump into our discussion with Dominic about his book, The Answer is a Question. Dominic, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, you say in the book that in many ways we're all Frankenstein managers. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a comment that's drawn a lot of feedback, and I think a lot of people resonate with this idea. It's based on the idea that when we first become a line manager, no one ever really sits you down and says that, now you have a team. Here, ostensibly, is how you might want to start to adapt your communication style. And here's how you might want to engage with people to more fully draw from their talents. And so we're thrown into the deep end, and very much we have to make up our own management approach as we go along. We pick up on the bits and bobs we've learned from various courses, the experiences we've had with managers perhaps who didn't manage us particularly well. We make that mark in our brain. We won't do things like that. And gradually we bolt on these bits and pieces so that our management persona begins to take shape. But when we really look at it, it's a bit of a Frankenstein persona, because there isn't a uniform style that we should be hoping to sort of attain in terms of our management engagement. So each one of us is a Frankenstein manager built from the experiences that we've had along the way. And that's a real challenge, because no one has really sat down to really formulate the ideas and the principles of what should good line management look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can think of there's times where I bolted on this from one boss and this from one boss. And, and I never really thought of it as like a Frankenstein thing. Like one guest called it a borrowed authority, like you're borrowing all this stuff. And there can be some aspect of learning that way, but like you said, it's not a cohesive thing. And so, and then we kind of pass our Frankensteinness off to other people. So what would be some weaknesses of existing coaching approaches, would you say? And then how is what you call operational coaching different?
Sure. So in recognition of the fact that there's a whole variety of management development courses out there, and a lot of them focus on the what of management, not necessarily the how of management. We all sort of know the sorts of things we should be doing as an effective manager, and learning how to give feedback, learning how to do appraisals, all that sort of thing. We sort of know that. But that sort of training is quite transactional. And again, it just contributes to the bolt-on pieces that become our Frankenstein manager. So in response to that, organizations have recognized there's a real opportunity to bring coaching into the organization. This might be a way that we can teach our managers to coach their team more effectively. And in seeking how to do that, most organizations turn to the training market, and the only training that exists for coaching is the training that exists for teaching people to become an executive coach. So businesses sort of pick up that training, rebadge it as manager as coach, and set out to teach their managers how to be a coach. But of course, a manager has a day job as an effective line manager, and trying to be a coach to someone who's a direct report is very challenging, especially when you have your own agenda for that direct report. So it's a very uncomfortable way of sort of sitting down people and trying to coach them. So we were working with a number of clients who were expressing this disappointment that despite massive training programs to teach managers these manager as coach skills, it wasn't having a notable impact on the organization. So we actually undertook a prolonged period of about 4 months of research, looking at all the courses out there, all the things that were being taught, and we recognized that very little was being taught around mindset or the behaviors. People were being taught how to do coaching rather than how to use coaching as a skill. And so we started doing some behavioral work with managers, and started to really help them to think about how they become present in the moment, how they, when they're interacting with people, really start to tune into what does this person need from me right now? And if that was a coachable moment, then how can I engage them with a question which I've designed to stimulate their thinking so that they can retain ownership of the problem that we're dealing with right now? And over time, this set of behaviors that we're working with managers on really took shape to form a new management model we call STAR. And managers who learn now to apply the STAR model are actually developing what we now call an operational coaching style of management, where they're looking for those moments throughout the day where they can engage with people differently.
So I took from your book that it's not, okay, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's time for coaching. It is operational coaching. It's, hey, this is a moment. This is an opportunity right here. And so it's less an event and it's more operational. It's just part of the day. And to my impression is, after reading the book, the STAR model is really, it's like the backbone. It is the core of the book. And it starts with S, which stands for stop and change the state. So why does it all start with reminding us to stop?
Well, just harking back to that Frankenstein manager, we have another challenge with becoming a Frankenstein manager is that we pick up poor habits. As a manager, in the absence of anyone sitting us down and telling us how we should be managing, we sort of build this mental model that we are the grown-up in the room, and that when there's a problem, we should step in to resolve that, because we probably know how to do that, because we were probably promoted from a role where we were solving those sorts of problems. And so we dive in to solve problems all the time. But what we don't recognize is that every time we're doing that, we're potentially marginalizing our team members, because they've not now had an opportunity to show the thinking they could have done. We've robbed them of that opportunity to learn something for themselves. We've taken away from them that opportunity to impress us. And of course, at the same time, we've removed any possibility of giving them perhaps some appreciative feedback later on. So this whole idea of stop is we need managers, and when we're working with them, we help them to do this, really to think through the situations they face every day. And a typical busy manager might have 16 to 20 personal interactions with people a day. If we can just tune into a small handful of those and really think about, how could I just bite my lip? How can I just stop long enough to take almost that mental breath, that step back, to now be present in the moment, to think about, what does this person need from me? And if it is then a potential a coachable moment, how do I now then formulate a question to ask them? And then going on from that, if I've now had a conversation with them, I've been asking them questions, I've helped them determine an action they can take. How do I gain some commitment from them that they're going to follow through on that action, which means then that I can agree a follow-up with them, which is that opportunity to potentially give them some appreciative feedback. So the stop, the think, the ask, and then securing a result became this STAR model that we codified from this behavioral work we were doing.
Yes, very memorable. I agree with everything you said. I think the hardest part for me is catching myself.
Oh, yeah.
So I do bite my lip, and I'm sure that's not an Andy problem. I think that's a human problem. But what I like about, you don't just say stop, you also talk about stop triggers. So I'd love for you to explain, or at least introduce us to, what do you mean by a stop trigger? And I'd be interested, if you're up for sharing, can you think of any stop triggers that you personally use in any sort of context, just as an example?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, changing behavior is incredibly challenging. Our brain is working very hard to sort of codify everything we do, and automate that, so we don't have to use so much brain power. Okay, so when we're presented with problems, we almost have an immediate response to want to start solving it. We're already starting to think about solutions before we've even really fully understood the problem. So learning to stop ourselves from doing that is really hard. So one of the things that people going through our programs and is mentioned in the book is, how do we build triggers then? How do we look for those things that we can really focus on developing into our mind's eye a trigger that gets us to stop? And a typical example might be, we were working with a senior lady recently, and she said a trigger for her was, every time someone stuck their face around her office door, she would sort of harumph because she was being interrupted. And she recognized that was really disenfranchising people, and they were less willing to stick their head around the door. So what she did, and really interesting, she created an environmental trigger. She put a little yellow sticky smiley face on the doorpost at eye height of people sticking their head around the door. So every time she looked up, she would immediately see their face and a smiley face. And instead of going harumph, she would change state to smile and start to rise herself up from the desk as if to invite people in. And that was a real shift in her state by creating an environmental trigger. And triggers can be just about anything. I mean, when we work with people, we invite them to think about maybe one or two individuals in their team who, for some reason, they never seem to jive well in their relationship. And it's often helpful to think about, well, what are the circumstances where you're coming across those people most frequently? And really then thinking about, well, next time you see them, how can you change your physical demeanor towards them? How can you adapt your behavior? And the way you do that is you see that happening, and you see yourself in your mind's eye changing your state, changing your demeanor, and you rehearse that over and over and over again in your mind, so that hopefully when that person does enter your domain, that trigger fires off, and you immediately then change your status and your demeanor towards that individual, which now provides the opportunity to have a much more positive interaction with them. And that's what we mean by triggers. And triggers need to be rehearsed, because unless we have those triggers, nothing will change. Our habits, our automated, laid down habits will always drive us, and will continue to do the same things. I mean, a really small example we talk about in the book is, how many times you might go up to your children's bedroom with the intent to go and talk to them about their school day or whatever, and you walk in and there's just mess strewn all over the floor. And immediately you go straight into parent mode. Oh my God, look at this mess. And actually working really, really hard to build a trigger, perhaps of putting your hand on the door handle and really reinforcing then the door handle as being a trigger for creating a positive state as you walk into the room with a smile, to prevent yourself being shocked by what's on the floor. And so you stay in state. So that's just a really small example, but they need to be rehearsed. Otherwise nothing changes.
Yeah, I love the idea of the rehearse. And for some reason, the terminology used in the book about pre-live them really resonated with me. It's like I'm rehearsing, but I'm pre-living. You even talk about, I don't know if it's fair to say, the cognitive science or the behavioral science behind it, of your brain kind of doesn't know the difference. Like you're reliving it. It's as if you lived it, right? Yeah. And you also talk about anchors, by the way. And I'd be curious, can you think of an anchor that you use, or maybe a client has used, and how you've embedded that for yourself to use it as kind of to build on this idea?
Yeah, and it's a really important distinction, because there's a difference between triggers. Triggers get us to stop. Mm-hmm. An anchor is what we pull on to change our state. So a really great example, I'll share a personal one that we used with our daughter many years ago. She was very nervous about sitting for her school examinations. And so we worked with her to create an anchor state based around holding the pen. And we would get her to hold the pen, and we'd get her to go back in her mind's eye to a place where she had felt really, really powerful, where I think she'd done a school presentation, and it had gone really, really well. And she got lots of applause for doing this presentation. So she was holding the pen and at the same time imagining that positive state, really imagining how she felt strong and powerful and being validated by her classmates. And she would rehearse that anchor over and over and over again, such that we knew and were confident that when she sat down that exam room and picked up that pen, she would be able to recall that positive state before she embarked then on conducting the exam. So that's a really good example of an anchor. And in work life, we have so many different examples of anchors that people use. And what we're asking them to do here is to attach a really positive state, a state where they are open and amenable to people, to some physical something. So one that comes up frequently is people just twisting their wedding ring, for example, attaching that really positive feeling that they had when they were at their wedding, really thinking about how they're engaging with people and how they're open to people and how they're really able to talk to people, and just that slew of emotions they were feeling, which is very, very positive. And that's a very powerful, common one that people use. We have other people that have an elastic band that they flick on their wrist, or a famous one we'd have all been familiar with was the power pose, right, yeah, before you go on stage. Right, yeah. And that's a form of an anchor where we're gearing ourselves up to be in a different state. And that's what we're looking for, is an anchor that you develop, which helps you quickly get into your coaching state so that you're present in the moment, can really see and acknowledge the person in front of you, be open and amenable to them, and ready to engage them in an inquiry-led dialogue.
What's cool about it is nobody has to know what's going on. Like some of the examples you talk about in the book, like a finger tap, or it could be it could be anything. I think it would be people would be oblivious to it, but it's just something that simple that gets us into a state that this is why the process, I think, can work so quickly, is you don't have to go through these 59 steps in a checklist.
No, and that's the thing, is it's about having the confidence to let's find some situations where I really want to change how I engage people in those situations. Let me build some triggers around that to get me to stop. Let me really work on an anchor that gets me quickly into a state where I know I'm going to be able to engage with them positively. And that's the behavioral part of the STAR model. Learning to stop and think is very much about breaking our habit, developing that behavior where I'm ready now to engage with somebody. And the ask and the result part is skill-based. It's learning, how do I construct questions? How can I really construct a question that's going to reach into someone's mind and help them to think for themselves?
Yeah.
And there is real skill around that. I think for most of us, the most training we will ever have received on asking questions. So I'll give it to you now. It's about 4 seconds. You ready?
Yeah.
Ask open questions. That was it. That was it. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah.
That was it. But there's so much more when we really
So
start to look at the impact that questions have. And with very, very little effort, we can start to really amp up the reflective power of our questions to really help people think at a different level, and really start to make new connections in their brains and come up with new insights and new ideas. And that's what we're learning. That's why it's skill-based. We have to learn how to ask questions, but more importantly, ask them in the flow of dialogue. We're not trying to create a condition where I'm going to go into coaching mode right now.
Right.
Yeah, we don't want that.
Right.
You mentioned just now, it's about making this a part of natural dialogue to the point where you might even have people thanking you for your advice, but you actually gave no advice at all. You just asked them questions and they came up with it all themselves. So A&R is the skills part.
You know, when I think of the T for the think, one thing I took away from that section is I really need to think, is this a coachable moment or not? Because I can think of times with, for example, my kids, like, this is not the time. Like, they're not going to listen. It's not, I'm not maybe in the state as much as I've tried. Yeah. So I'm curious from your perspective, because you have a lot of examples in the book. What's an example of a time or situation it's not a coachable moment? And then maybe example of one that is.
Yeah, that's a great question, and by no means are we suggesting that sort of people try and sort of take on the mantle of being a social worker, and we just go around asking questions all the time. It's not about that at all. This is about an additional string to our management bow. It's about knowing how and when to engage with people more effectively, to draw from their talent. And so we always say that we're using an operational coaching approach in those situations where there's the potential for a better outcome. And of course, there are going to be those situations where it's not appropriate. If you're dealing with someone who's very het up or they're very stressed, they're possibly not going to be in a situation to want to be asked questions where they're really going to have to do some deep thinking. But that doesn't mean that we can't return to that situation later on. So we often say, if not now, then when? And it might be that somebody might need strong direction from you in that split second. But actually, we can pick that up later on in a future conversation where we're actually going to ask them some questions about what led to that, how might we have avoided that, what actions could you have taken that would have prevented you having to get into that state. So I think emergency situations are probably not coachable moments. If there's a fire, I'm the first one out. Follow me. No questions needed. But pretty much any other time, unless someone's very emotional or het up or we are under an incredible time pressure, then most situations are opportunities for a coachable moment. And each person needs to learn for themselves about the circumstances they face each day, the people they interact with, and determine for themselves what will make a coachable moment for them. And that's why we don't have a cookie cutter approach to say it's always like this or it's always like that. And people learn then almost a split second diagnosis in the head for, right, is this a coachable moment right now? And they will make that determination themselves. And what we're aiming for is to, maybe have 3 or 4 conversations a day, which are more operationally coaching focused.
Yeah. I suppose a risk of any model is that people use it as a technique instead of it, like you said, this flow of the conversation, and maybe it comes off as disingenuous if we like for example, I appreciate the book was not just a list of the top 10 clever questions for managers to ask, because those books exist, right?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. So what are some examples of questions, maybe by structure or in any other way, that make them less effective and then make them more effective?
Yeah, and there's a really big section in the book, and in fact, there's 2 chapters dedicated to asking questions, because there, when we started this work, which we started probably 15 years ago, we actually went to the scientific literature. You would be astonished. There is so little research on the impact that questions can have on the cognitive functioning of someone else's brain. All we could really find was some work around questionnaire design and survey design for emotive word usage. But so the work we've done is really focused on, well, how can you architect questions to stimulate people in different ways? And just for example, we have identified different types of questions. And 2 or 3 of them which are really useful are at the point where you're having a conversation with someone and you're trying to help them develop new insights about a situation. So they might have a problem they're facing, and you're trying to get them to wrestle with that problem and see what they can shake from it onto the table that we can start to review. So a useful question we can ask is something we call shifting perspective. So they're familiar with the problem, but you get them to change their thinking by saying, well, how might someone from another department address this question? Or what would your boss see as the most important aspects of this situation to address? So for a second, they're having to take themselves out of themselves and put them in someone else's perspective. And that's a good way, perhaps, of shaking loose some new insights from taking a different perspective. Another method might be a type of question we call change context. So, we've got this problem now. Let's change the context in this question. If this had happened at the weekend, what would we be doing differently right now? So completely change the context. We're not dismissing the problem. We're using a provocative questioning technique to get them to see a different angle on it and see what that shakes out in terms of new insight. And then the third one, a lot of people are limited in their thinking because they place barriers in the way of their thinking. So a good example there to challenge barriers might be, what is it that makes you think you can't ring up your boss? What is it makes you think that you can't pull 2 or 3 people together from that other department to address this? And they start then to break down these barriers, and they start to see new possibilities for a way forward or new ideas they can generate. So they're just 3 types of stimulating questions we can use to help people ideate, to develop new insights. And those questions are designed to shake stuff out of the situation onto the table that we can pick through and say, well, okay, some of those insights then, which 1 or 2 of those might be something that you could move forward on or take action on. And then the conversation is really helping them select 1 or 2 of those to take action on, and then work with them to gain some commitment to them taking those actions. And I think this is especially powerful in the field of project management, because I've been a project manager for many years myself, and I worked in change management consulting. And so often the situations where we can ask these more provocative questions, especially if we're working in the client side, where they might have a lot of organizational knowledge, knowing how to stimulate that thinking and pull and draw the best of their insights onto the table for us to review is a key project management skill.
Yeah. And I don't know, as I've reflected on this after reading the book, it can help me in what we've been talking about, coaching situations, but I feel like it helps me to think differently too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm amazed at how my approach is the only one, or the brilliant, or there's an obstacle. And so it's something that can transform our ability as managers, but also self-leadership too.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we just had a success reported to us by somebody who was undertaking our program, the Star Manager program. And this was somebody who worked in procurement. And he had a supplier coming in the next day, a typical annual supplier meeting where we go through line by line and shave a few cents off here and there. And as a result of what he'd learned on the program, he decided not to do that. And he actually ripped up his planned approach and spent the evening formulating 5 really powerful questions which would foster greater collaboration between them and the supplier. And the supplier knew nothing of this, turned up next day for their 2-hour review with all their sheets of paper, with all the line by lines. And he told them what he'd like to do. And they were up for it. Scheduled for 2 hours. The meeting went on until 6 p.m. I think they were there for 7 hours or something. And they all ended up going to the bar afterwards. After that day, they identified 3.2 million euros of mutual benefit. And this was fundamentally because he'd had the presence of mind to think about what could be the most powerful questions that I could put in front of this supplier for us to deepen our relationship and to find that mutual benefit for how we're working together. And by skillfully asking questions, that they pulled so much from that supplier in terms of ideas and ideation between them. And so I agree with you 100%. I think this is a skill for life. Indeed, we have we have so many people writing to say, can't we develop the Star Parent book? It would be so helpful. Perhaps one day.
Well, actually, that's because there's so many things we could talk about, including the result. But I just want to ask this last question. I mean, sure. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. So can you think of some ways that you and your wife have used these ideas as a parent?
I will not hold myself up as perfect in any way, but we've both been working in this field for a long time. Our children are teenagers now. And from the earliest age, I think our children have picked up on this as well. I can remember, and we mentioned this in the front of the book, but when they were quite young, they asked an amazing question of us as, Mummy, Daddy, what would have to happen for you to want to buy us ice cream? That is a sophisticated question right there. It presupposes that if they do that, then we're going to buy. We call that a preemptive close. Very, very good. But no, in terms of parenting, I wouldn't seek to advise anyone on how to parent. But those opportunities where we recognise that we've got common things we do over and over. There's things where I did it again, like shouting at your kids for clearing up the room. I mean, it's you just become a nag, and we're all there. We're all guilty of that. And I think if we can just identify one or two of those things where we're continually nagging, and find a different way of engaging with them, perhaps even asking questions about, are they aware of how that makes me feel? How can we work together on this? Trying to engage them in a way where we can help them see a way where they can change their behavior rather than telling. And telling does not work. You have to engage. Only people can change their own behavior.
And that's coaching advice. That's parenting advice. I found that as a result of this book, just even the stop part when it comes to parenting, of pre-living situations. Before we started recording, you and I talked about a situation. I think just this situation of changing our state at home, I think has the ability to transform marriages, has relationships of all kinds. And so,
well, it does. And I think that's one of the most powerful questions for anybody in a relationship, which is, you're talking to your partner in the evening and they're expressing some issues or they're unhappy about something. I think having the presence of mind to ask yourself the question, what does my partner need from me right now? And, I'm guilty of this as any other husband might be, of wanting to fix my wife's problems and help her out because we want to do that. We want to help. But actually what they really just want is to be heard, and they want empathy. And actually, if we can just answer that question, what does my partner need from me right now, would change everything.
Yeah, well, for those listening, we barely touched the surface of this powerful book. If you'd like a proven model for transforming your impact as a manager, as a leader, maybe as a parent, get a copy of Dominic's book, The Answer is a Question. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Dominic, thank you for joining us on the
Absolute
People and
pleasure.
Projects
Thank
podcast.
you.